The crystal palace stretched high into the purple sky of Zephyros Prime. Its walls caught the light from 3 suns and threw rainbows across the marble floors. Queen Lirelai walked through the grand hall, her forearms moving gracefully as she prepared for another day of meetings. She stood 7 feet tall with shimmering blue skin that seemed to glow from within. Her people, the Zephyrians, had ruled this part of the galaxy for over 1,000 years. Today was different. The humans were coming to talk about trade. Lirelai had heard stories about these strange creatures from the outer edge of the galaxy. They had only learned to travel between stars recently. Most other species considered them weak and primitive. They had no great weapons, no vast fleets, and no impressive technology. But they wanted to buy rare crystals from Zephyrian worlds, and the Queen was curious about them. Jake Morrison stepped off the transport ship and looked up at the towering palace. He was an ordinary-looking man with brown hair and tired eyes. His simple gray suit looked plain next to the bright robes of the alien diplomats around him. Jake carried a small briefcase and walked quietly toward the palace entrance. Other ambassadors pushed past him, talking loudly about their important business. Inside the palace, the meeting room buzzed with activity. Representatives from dozens of worlds sat around a massive circular table. The Caraxian ambassador, a creature that looked like a giant mantis, clicked his mandibles impatiently. The Valdorian delegate, covered in thick fur and standing 8 feet tall, growled something about human weakness. They all waited for the Queen to arrive. When Lirelai entered the room, everyone stood. She moved to her throne at the head of the table and gestured for them to sit. Her golden eyes swept across the gathered diplomats until they found Jake. He sat quietly in a corner chair, reading through his papers. Unlike the others, he did not stare at her or try to catch her attention. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Each ambassador presented their credentials and spoke about their world's power and importance. The Caraxian boasted about their military might. The Valdorian mentioned their vast mining operations. When Jake's turn came, he stood slowly and spoke in a soft voice. "I am Jake Morrison from Earth," he said simply. "We are a young species and we have much to learn. We hope to trade fairly with your people and build friendship between our worlds." Several aliens laughed at his words. The Caraxian clicked his mandibles in what sounded like amusement. But Queen Lirelai leaned forward, interested by his honesty. Most diplomats came here with threats or grand promises. This human seemed different. The trade discussions went on for hours. Jake listened carefully to every word but spoke little. When he did offer suggestions, they were practical and fair. He never demanded special treatment or made unreasonable requests. While other ambassadors argued and shouted, Jake remained calm and patient. During a break, Queen Lirelai found herself walking toward Jake. He was standing by a large window, looking out at the palace gardens. She approached quietly, curious about this strange human. "Your world must be very different from this one," she said. Jake turned and smiled. "It is, Your Majesty. But beauty exists everywhere. Your gardens remind me of places back home." They talked for several minutes about simple things. Jake described Earth's seasons and how crops grew in cycles. He spoke about his sister Amy, who ran a farm in Kansas, and how she grew corn and wheat under a yellow sun. Lirelai found herself relaxing as she listened. Most people who spoke to her wanted something or treated her like a distant goddess. Jake talked to her like she was just a person. Over the following weeks, the trade negotiations continued. Jake proved to be a skilled negotiator, always finding solutions that helped both sides. He worked late into the night, studying reports and preparing fair proposals. The Queen often saw him in the palace library, reading about Zephyrian history and culture. One evening, Lirelai found Jake in the gardens. He was sitting by a fountain, feeding small native birds with crumbs from his dinner. The birds, usually afraid of strangers, perched on his hands without fear. "They like you," Lirelai observed, sitting on a nearby bench. "Animals are honest," Jake replied. "They don't judge you by your title or your species. They just know if you mean them harm or not." They began meeting in the gardens regularly. Jake would tell stories about Earth, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. He spoke about human art and music, about how his people believed that leaders should serve others rather than rule them. Lyra Lee had never heard such ideas before. On my world, Jake explained one evening, we choose our leaders. If they do not serve the people well, we choose different ones. That sounds like chaos, Lyra Lee said, but she was fascinated. Sometimes it is messy, Jake admitted. But people fight harder for something they helped choose than for something forced upon them. As months passed, their friendship deepened into something more. Jake treated Lyra Lee not as the all-powerful queen of 2,000 worlds, but as Lyra, the woman who worried about her people and sometimes felt lonely despite being surrounded by millions of subjects. She began to see past his quiet manner, to the strength and wisdom underneath. The day Jake proposed was simple and private. They were in his small quarters, sharing a meal of earth vegetables he had grown in a corner of the royal gardens. He offered her a plain metal ring, nothing fancy or jeweled. I know this is not what queens usually receive, he said. But this belonged to my grandmother. She was a farmer's wife who raised 6 children and helped build a community. I thought, you might understand what it represents. Lyra Lee took the ring with all 4 hands. It represents love that serves others, she said softly. Yes, I understand. The wedding was a grand affair that amazed the galaxy. Representatives from hundreds of worlds came to watch the mighty Zephyrian queen marry a humble human diplomat. Jake's family arrived from Earth, simple people from Kansas who seemed overwhelmed by the alien splendor but proud of their son. As they exchanged vows under the light of 3 suns, few in the crowd understood what they were really witnessing. They saw a powerful alien ruler taking an exotic pet, a political marriage that might benefit trade. They did not see 2 people who had found something rare and precious in each other. The ceremony ended with traditional Zephyrian music and Earth folk songs. Jake's sister Amy played her guitar while alien dignitaries danced to rhythms they had never heard before. Queen Lyra Lee and her human husband stood together, ready to face whatever the future might bring, though neither could imagine how soon that future would test them both. 3 years passed quietly in the Crystal Palace. Jake had settled into his role as queen consort, though many court members still whispered about the human who had somehow captured their queen's heart. He spent his days reading in the vast royal library, learning about the history of the Zephyrian Empire and the hundreds of species that lived under its protection. The library became Jake's favorite place. The ancient building held millions of books and data crystals from across the galaxy. Jake would sit for hours, reading about old wars, trade agreements, and the rise and fall of civilizations. The elderly Zephyrian librarian, a gentle being, named Corveth, became his friend. Corveth was amazed by how quickly the human learned their language and absorbed complex information. You read like a scholar, Corveth often said. Most warriors and politicians have no patience for books. Knowledge is never wasted, Jake would reply, turning another page. Jake also kept a small garden behind the palace. He had brought seeds from Earth and grown tomatoes, lettuce, and corn in the alien soil. The palace staff were fascinated by these strange plants. The head cook, a 4-armed Zephyrian named Velka, loved to experiment with the new vegetables. She would create dishes that mixed Earth flavors with local spices, delighting the queen and her guests. These tomatoes are wonderful, Velka would tell Jake as she prepared dinner. They add such color to our meals. Your people must be very wise farmers. Jake would smile and help her in the kitchen, showing her how his grandmother had prepared certain dishes. He never spoke about his past beyond his diplomatic career, and most people assumed he had always been a peaceful negotiator who preferred books to battles. The palace maintenance staff also grew fond of the quiet human. Jake would often walk through the lower levels of the building, talking with the technicians who kept the advanced systems running. He asked thoughtful questions about how the defense shields worked and how the communication arrays connected to distant worlds. The workers appreciated his genuine interest in their jobs. Most nobles never notice us, said Torvin, the chief maintenance engineer. But Jake remembers our names and asks about our families. Queen Lyra Lee watched her husband with growing love and respect. He had brought a sense of peace to her life that she had never known. The demands of ruling such a vast empire often left her feeling isolated and burdened. But Jake listened to her concerns without judgment and offered gentle advice when she asked for it. "Sometimes I feel like I am drowning in the needs of 2,000 worlds," she confided to him one evening as they walked through the gardens. "You cannot solve every problem yourself," Jake replied. "Good leaders know when to delegate and when to trust others. Your people are strong and capable. Let them help carry the burden." Their quiet life was interrupted when urgent messages began arriving from the outer rim of the empire. A species called the Zarathi swarm had attacked several border worlds. The Zarathi were insectoid creatures that lived in a hive mind, thinking and acting as one vast organism. They consumed everything in their path, leaving dead worlds behind them. At first, the attack seemed like typical border raids. The Zephyrian military had dealt with aggressive species before. General Korvac, the Queen's brother and the Empire's top military commander, assured everyone that the situation would be resolved quickly. "The Zarathi are numerous but not particularly advanced," he reported in the first War Council meeting. "Our superior weapons and tactics should drive them back within a few months." Jake attended these meetings as Queen Consort, but he rarely spoke. He would sit quietly in a corner chair, listening to the military discussions with the same patient attention he gave to everything else. When he did offer suggestions, they were about practical matters like organizing refugee camps or improving supply lines to the front. "Perhaps we should establish temporary shelters on Kepler 7, he suggested during one meeting. "It is close enough to the fighting to help refugees quickly, but far enough away to be safe." The generals nodded politely at such suggestions, but clearly considered them the thoughts of a well-meaning civilian. They focused on battle plans and weapon deployments, confident that Zephyrian military might would prevail as it always had. But the reports from the front lines grew more disturbing each week. The Zarathi seemed to be learning from each battle, adapting their tactics in ways no one had seen before. Weapons that destroyed them in one fight proved useless in the next. Ships that had been effective against them were suddenly vulnerable to new forms of attack. "It is like fighting an enemy that evolves during the battle," General Korvac reported, his confidence beginning to crack. "Every time we develop a counter to their tactics, they change again." Jake listened to these reports with growing concern, though he kept his thoughts to himself. He began spending even more time in the library, researching everything available about hive mind species and their behavior patterns. He also started taking longer walks through the palace, often ending up in the communication center or the defense monitoring stations. The technicians welcomed his visits, assuming the Queen's husband was simply curious about how their equipment worked. Jake would ask innocent questions about signal frequencies and detection ranges, always praising their expertise and dedication. "You must see everything that happens in this sector," he would say to the communications officer. "Yes, we monitor all traffic within 50 light years," the officer would reply proudly, showing Jake the various displays and controls. As the Zarathi attacks intensified, more refugees arrived at the capital world. Huge ships filled with displaced families crowded the spaceports. Jake spent many hours helping coordinate relief efforts, working alongside palace staff to distribute food and find temporary housing. His gentle manner and practical suggestions made him popular with both the refugees and the aid workers. One evening, as Jake helped serve meals in a refugee center, an elderly Zephyrian woman approached him. She had fled from one of the first worlds attacked by the Zarathi. "Thank you for your kindness," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "In all the chaos, it means so much to see someone who cares." "We are all part of the same community," Jake replied, offering her a bowl of soup. "Taking care of each other is what makes us civilized." That night, Jake found Queen Lyra standing on their private balcony, looking up at the stars. She seemed smaller somehow, burdened by the weight of the crisis facing her empire. "I received another report today," she said without turning around. "The Zarathi have taken 3 more worlds. Our fleets cannot seem to stop them." Jake moved to stand beside her, taking one of her hands in both of his. "Your military is the finest in the galaxy. They will find a way." "What if they do not?" "Lyra, asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I am the queen who loses everything our people have built? Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the distant stars where battles raged beyond their sight. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unexpected places, he said finally. Have faith in your people. They are stronger than they know. Neither of them realized how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how soon Jake himself would need to demonstrate the truth behind them. The quiet years were ending, and the real test of their marriage and their empire was about to begin. The war councils grew more urgent as each week brought worse news from the front lines. Queen Lyrelai sat at the head of the massive table while her generals and admirals reported one defeat after another. The holographic display in the center of the room showed the steady advance of the Zerathi swarm through Zephyrian space. Red markers indicated lost worlds, and there were far too many of them. Nexus 7 has fallen, General Korvac announced, his four arms gesturing helplessly at the display. They consumed the entire population in less than a day. Our evacuation fleet barely escaped. Jake sat in his usual chair near the wall, listening to every word. He had been attending these meetings for months now, watching as the Empire's greatest military minds struggled against an enemy unlike any they had faced before. The Zerathi fought with a coordination that seemed impossible, as if millions of individual creatures were controlled by a single, terrifyingly intelligent mind. Admiral Zenith, a tall Zephyrian with scars from a dozen campaigns, pointed to the tactical display. Our conventional weapons are useless now. They have adapted to everything we throw at them. Plasma cannons that melted their ships last month barely scratched them today. What about the new quantum torpedoes? Asked General Varek, desperation creeping into his voice. Tested and countered within 3 battles, Zenith replied grimly. It is as if they learn from every shot we fire, every tactic we employ. We are fighting an enemy that becomes stronger with each encounter. Jake absorbed every detail while appearing to simply listen politely. Behind his calm expression, his mind was working through the tactical reports, analyzing patterns that the Zephyrian commanders could not see. He had begun to understand something crucial about the Zerathi, but he remained silent. The situation became truly desperate when long-range scouts reported a massive Zerathi construction project at Nexus Station, a major shipyard that had fallen 3 weeks earlier. The enemy was building something enormous there, using resources stripped from conquered worlds. Intelligence suggests it is some kind of superweapon, General Korvac reported, his voice heavy with defeat. Combined with their main fleet, it could threaten the capital itself. Queen Lyrelai listened to the reports with growing despair. Her people had never lost a war in their 1,000-year history. The Zephyrian Empire was built on military superiority and tactical brilliance, but both seemed worthless against this enemy. How long do we have? She asked quietly. Our best estimates suggest 2 months before they can launch a major assault on this system, Admiral Zenith replied. Perhaps less if they continue to accelerate their advance. After the meeting ended, Jake walked through the palace corridors deep in thought. He passed refugee centers filled with families who had lost everything. Children who would never see their home worlds again played in the halls, while their parents tried to maintain hope they clearly did not feel. In the library, Korveth, the librarian, approached him with obvious concern. The situation looks very dark, does it not? Dark times often reveal hidden strengths, Jake replied, pulling an ancient text about military history from the shelves. Sometimes the answer is not in fighting harder, but in fighting differently. That evening, Jake found Queen Lyrelai in their private chambers, staring at reports from the battlefield. She looked exhausted, the weight of 2,000 worlds pressing down on her shoulders. I do not know what to do, she admitted, setting down a data pad filled with casualty reports. My generals are the best in the galaxy, but they cannot find a way to stop this enemy. Perhaps we should consider evacuation, save what we can and retreat to the inner systems. Jake sat beside her, taking her hands in his. That would only delay the inevitable. The Zerathi do not stop until they have consumed everything. There has to be another way. What other way? Lyrelai asked, despair evident in her voice. We have tried everything. Better weapons, new tactics, coordinated fleet actions, nothing works against them. Jake was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with a decision that would change everything between them. Finally, he spoke carefully. What if the solution does not come from Zephyrian military doctrine? What if you need to think like a different species entirely? What do you mean? She asked, looking at him with confusion. Every military force has assumptions about how wars should be fought, Jake explained. The Zephyrians fight with honor, using superior technology and coordinated tactics, but what if your enemy cannot be beaten that way? What if you need to use methods that seem wrong or primitive to your people? Lorelei studied her husband's face. There was something different in his voice, a certainty that she had never heard before when he discussed military matters. You speak as if you have experience with such things. Jake met her gaze steadily. I have been thinking about this problem for months. I may have some ideas that could help. The next day brought more terrible news. 3 more worlds had fallen, and refugee fleets reported that the Zerathi were moving faster than ever before. The enemy seemed to be preparing for a final push toward the Empire's heart. In the War Council, General Korvac looked older than his years. At this rate, they will reach the outer defense perimeter in 6 weeks. Our forces are demoralized and our tactics are worthless. I do not see how we can stop them. Jake listened to the familiar litany of defeats and failures. He watched as brilliant military minds struggled with a problem that seemed impossible to solve using their traditional methods. Finally, he made his decision. May I make a suggestion? He asked quietly. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the human who had sat quietly through dozens of these meetings. General Korvac nodded politely, though his expression suggested he expected nothing useful from a diplomat. You have been fighting the Zerathi as if they were a normal enemy. Jake began, his voice steady and calm. But they are not normal. They are a hive mind, which means they think and act as a single organism. This gives them perfect coordination, but it also creates a weakness that you have not exploited. Admiral Zenith frowned. What weakness? Their coordination is their greatest strength. Every strength can become a weakness under the right circumstances, Jake replied. A hive mind depends on communication between its parts. Disrupt that communication, and the coordination becomes a liability. Our experts have analyzed their communication methods, General Varric protested. The signals are too complex and too well protected. We cannot jam them effectively. Jake smiled slightly. I am not talking about jamming their signals. I am talking about using their perfect coordination against them. He stood and moved to the tactical display, pointing to the pattern of Zerathi advances. Look at how they move. Every unit responds instantly to threats and opportunities. But what happens if you give them too many threats to respond to at once? What happens if their perfect coordination becomes perfect confusion? The generals looked at each other uncertainly. Queen Lorelei leaned forward, sensing something important in her husband's words. I do not understand, General Korvac admitted. How do you create confusion in a hive mind? Jake's answer would shock everyone in the room and reveal the truth that he had hidden for 3 years. But first, he needed them to understand that their assumptions about warfare itself were about to change forever. By fighting like humans, he said simply. The war room fell completely silent after Jake's words. General Korvac stared at the quiet human who had just suggested fighting like humans, as if that could somehow save the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Admiral Zenith laughed, but the sound held no humor. With respect to the Queen's husband, Zenith said, humans have barely learned to travel between stars. What could your people possibly teach us about warfare? Jake remained calm, but Queen Lorelei noticed something different in his posture. He stood straighter now, and his eyes held a confidence she had never seen before when he discussed military matters. You would be surprised, Jake replied quietly. But to explain what I mean, I need to tell you something about myself that I have never told anyone. He paused and looked directly at Queen Lorelei. 3 years ago, when I came to this world as a diplomat, I was not entirely honest about who I am. The room grew tense. General Korvac's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, while other officers shifted nervously in their chairs. Queen Lirelei felt her heart racing, though she was not sure if it was from fear or anticipation. Jake reached into his jacket and removed a small device. He placed it on the table and activated it with his thumbprint. A holographic display appeared, showing official documents that made several of the military leaders gasp in shock. "My name is Jake Morrison, but my rank is Colonel in the Terran Marine Special Forces. I served for 15 years in Earth's most elite military units before joining the Strategic Intelligence Division." The document showed a service record that was almost unbelievable. Jake had commanded successful operations against overwhelming odds on dozens of worlds. He had developed new tactics for asymmetric warfare that had saved countless lives. His decorations included medals for strategic brilliance that few soldiers in any species had ever earned. Admiral Zenith studied the holographic display with growing amazement. "These records, if they are real," Jake confirmed. Earth's government knew that first contact with advanced alien civilizations would be crucial to humanity's survival. They selected and trained their best people to serve as diplomatic observers, agents who would integrate into alien societies while assessing threats and opportunities. General Korvac found his voice first. "You have been spying on us for 3 years?" "I was," Jake admitted. "But my mission changed when I fell in love with your queen. My feelings for Lirelei and for your people became genuine. When I requested permission to reveal myself to help fight the Zerathi, Earth's government denied the request. They ordered me to remain neutral and continue gathering intelligence." He turned to face Queen Lirelei directly. "Last night I cut all communications with Earth and chose to stay here. I am no longer an agent of my home world. I am your husband and a citizen of the Zephyrian Empire, and I will use everything I know to help save our people." The silence that followed was deafening. Queen Lirelei stared at the man she had married, trying to process the revelation that their entire relationship had begun as a lie. The hurt and betrayal were obvious on her face, but the immediate crisis forced her to focus on practical matters. "Assuming these records are accurate," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "what exactly are you proposing?" Jake moved back to the tactical display, his demeanor now completely different. Gone was the quiet diplomat who offered gentle suggestions about refugee camps. In his place stood a military commander who radiated competence and authority. "The Zerathi swarm's greatest strength is their perfect coordination," he began, manipulating the holographic display to show enemy movement patterns. "Every unit responds instantly to threats and opportunities because they all share the same mind. But this creates a critical vulnerability." He highlighted the communication networks that linked Zerathi forces across multiple star systems. A hive mind requires constant information flow between all parts. The more complex their operations become, the more communication they need, and communication networks can be disrupted. "We have tried jamming their signals," General Varek protested. "It does not work." "I am not talking about jamming," Jake replied. "I am talking about overloading their ability to process information by giving them too many simultaneous problems to solve." He changed the display to show a new tactical approach that looked completely insane to traditional military thinking. Instead of large fleet battles, Jake proposed hundreds of small independent strike teams attacking communication nodes throughout Zerathi-controlled space. "You want us to scatter our forces?" Admiral Zenith asked in disbelief. "That goes against every principle of sound military strategy." "It goes against Zephyrian military strategy," Jake corrected. "But humans have been using guerrilla warfare tactics for thousands of years. Small mobile units striking targets of opportunity and disappearing before the enemy can respond." General Korvac studied the proposed battle plan with growing confusion. "But the Zerathi will adapt to these tactics just as they have adapted to everything else." "Not if we do it right," Jake explained. "The key is to hit so many targets simultaneously that their hive mind cannot process all the information fast enough to adapt. We overload their decision-making capacity." He pulled up detailed analysis of Zerathi communication patterns that he had been secretly studying for months. "Look at the data flows during their major battles. When they face a single large threat, they coordinate perfectly. But when they encounter multiple small threats, there is a delay in their response time. The hive mind has to prioritize, and that creates opportunities. Queen Lyrelai found herself leaning forward despite her emotional turmoil. How long have you been analyzing their behavior? Since the attacks began, Jake admitted. I have been using my access to palace intelligence systems to study everything we know about the Zarathi. Your security protocols are excellent against external threats, but they were not designed to stop someone who was already inside. The revelation that Jake had been secretly conducting intelligence operations from within the palace for months sent another shock through the room. But the military leaders were beginning to see the potential in his unconventional approach. Even if your theory is correct, General Korvac said slowly, implementing such a strategy would require completely restructuring our entire military doctrine. We would need to retrain our forces, modify our ships, and coordinate hundreds of independent operations. We have 6 weeks, Jake replied simply. It can be done if everyone commits to it completely. Admiral Zenith shook his head. The risk is enormous. If your theory is wrong, we will have scattered our forces and made ourselves vulnerable to a conventional attack. If we continue with conventional tactics, we will lose anyway, Jake pointed out. The Zarathi have already proven that they can adapt to everything in your current military handbook. We need to try something they have never seen before. Queen Lyrelai stood and moved to the tactical display, studying Jake's proposed strategy. The personal betrayal still stung, but she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he was offering. This was not just a new battle plan, it was a complete revolution in military thinking. You said you chose us over Earth, she said quietly. Prove it. Give us everything you know about human warfare tactics. Show us how to fight like your people. Jake nodded solemnly. I will teach your officers everything I learned in 15 years of special operations, but I need your complete trust and authority to implement this strategy. Half measures will not work against the Zarathi. General Korvac looked at his sister, the Queen, then back at the human who had just revealed himself to be one of the most experienced military strategists in known space. If we do this, there is no going back. We will be gambling the survival of our entire civilization on the theories of an alien warrior. We are already gambling our survival, Queen Lyrelai replied. At least now we have a chance to win. The decision would reshape not only the war against the Zarathi, but the entire relationship between humans and the galactic community. Jake had revealed his true nature, but the real test of his abilities was yet to come. The next 6 weeks transformed the Zephyrian military in ways that seemed impossible. Jake worked 18 hours a day, training officers in tactics that went against everything they had learned about warfare. He taught them about mobility over firepower, surprise over strength, and chaos over order. Forget everything you know about honorable combat, Jake told a group of ship commanders in one training session. The Zarathi do not care about honor. They care about winning. If you want to beat them, you have to think like predators, not like knights. Queen Lyrelai watched her husband work with a mixture of admiration and lingering hurt. The gentle diplomat she had married was gone, replaced by a military strategist whose competence was undeniable. But the knowledge that their entire relationship had begun as a deception still stung deeply. You never trusted me with the truth, she said to him one evening as he studied tactical reports in their private chambers. Jake looked up from his work, exhaustion clear in his eyes. At first it was my mission to stay hidden. Later I was afraid that telling you would destroy what we had built together. I was a coward. And now? Now I am betting everything on the hope that you can forgive me, he replied honestly. Because I cannot save your empire without your complete trust and support. The preparation was intense and demanding. Jake divided the Zephyrian fleet into hundreds of small task forces, each capable of independent operation. He trained them to think like guerrilla fighters, rather than traditional naval officers. Most importantly, he taught them to embrace uncertainty and chaos instead of trying to control every aspect of battle. Admiral Zenith struggled with the new concepts. How can we coordinate hundreds of separate attacks without proper communication? It seems like madness, That is exactly the point, Jake explained. The Zarathi expect coordination and predictability. When they encounter true chaos, their hive mind will not know how to respond. They will try to find patterns that do not exist, and that confusion will be our advantage. The first test came sooner than expected. Zarathi scouts appeared at the edge of the solar system, probing the defenses around the capital world. Instead of meeting them with a conventional response, Jake deployed his new tactics. 50 small Zephyrian ships attacked the scouts from different directions, using hit-and-run tactics that seemed random but were carefully planned. Each ship would strike quickly and disappear before the enemy could respond, then reappear somewhere else entirely. The results were remarkable. The Zarathi scouts, accustomed to facing organized fleets, could not adapt to the chaotic assault. They tried to coordinate their defense, but every time they focused on one group of attackers, another would strike from an unexpected angle. Within hours, all the scout ships were destroyed with minimal Zephyrian losses. More importantly, the surviving data from the battle showed that the Zarathi hive mind had struggled to process the multiple simultaneous threats. It worked, General Korvac reported with amazement. Their response time increased dramatically when faced with multiple small attacks instead of one large assault. This was just a small test, Jake warned. The real battle will be much more complex. We need to coordinate simultaneous strikes across dozens of star systems while maintaining complete communication silence. The main Zarathi fleet began its advance toward the capital 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Long-range sensors detected over 10,000 enemy ships moving in perfect formation, supported by the massive superweapon they had been building at Nexus Station. Jake gathered his senior commanders for the final briefing. In 12 hours, we launch Operation Swarmbreak. Every task force will attack predetermined targets simultaneously. Once the operation begins, there will be no central command and no ability to change the plan. Each group must complete its mission independently. The strategy was breathtakingly ambitious. While the main Zarathi fleet advanced on the capital, Zephyrian strike teams would attack communication nodes, supply bases, and coordination centers throughout enemy-controlled space. The goal was not to destroy the swarm directly, but to fragment their collective intelligence. Queen Lyrelei stood with Jake in the command center as the operation began. Hundreds of small task forces disappeared into hyperspace, carrying the hopes of an entire civilization. There was nothing to do now but wait and see if human tactics could save the Zephyrian Empire. If this fails, we are all dead, she said, quietly. If this fails, we die fighting instead of surrendering, Jake replied. Sometimes that makes all the difference. The first reports came in 6 hours later. Strike teams across the galaxy were hitting their targets with devastating effect. Zarathi communication nodes exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Supply convoys found themselves under attack from enemies they could not see coming. Coordination centers that had managed the swarm's advance for months went silent in minutes. The effect on the main Zarathi fleet was immediate and catastrophic. Ships that had moved in perfect formation began to drift apart as communication links failed. Units that should have responded instantly to threats instead hesitated, waiting for orders that never came. Jake watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction as the enemy formation began to collapse. The hive mind is trying to re-establish control, but we are hitting targets faster than they can repair them. Their perfect coordination is becoming perfect confusion. The climax came when Jake personally led a strike team to destroy the primary coordination hub at Nexus Station. Using skills learned in Earth's special forces, he infiltrated the heavily defended facility, while his team provided distraction. The Zarathi defenders had never encountered human stealth techniques. Jake moved through their installations like a ghost, avoiding detection systems that were designed for different types of enemies. When he reached the central control chamber, he planted charges that would sever the swarm's primary communication network. The explosion lit up space for light years. In every direction. Instantly, the entire Zarathi invasion force lost its collective intelligence. Millions of individual creatures found themselves cut off from the hive mind that had guided their every action. Without central coordination, the swarm began to fragment into confused, isolated groups. Ships that had worked together perfectly now attacked their own allies by mistake. Ground forces on conquered worlds wandered aimlessly, no longer receiving orders from above. Zephyrian forces, trained in Jake's new tactics, pressed their advantage ruthlessly. They struck the confused enemy groups with overwhelming force, destroying scattered units that could no longer support each other. Within days, the tide of war completely reversed. The Zerathi swarm, which had seemed unstoppable just weeks before, was retreating in chaos from every front. Conquered worlds were liberated as the enemy forces abandoned their positions without coordination. The victory celebrations lasted for weeks, but Jake found himself standing alone in the palace gardens, watching the stars where battles still raged. Queen Lyrelai approached him quietly, her expression unreadable. "You saved us all," she said simply. "We saved ourselves," Jake corrected. "I just showed your people a different way to fight." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes before Lyrelai spoke again. "I have been thinking about what you told me, about choosing us over Earth. I meant every word. I know you did. And I have decided that while our marriage began with deception, it has grown into something real and strong. I forgive you, Jake Morrison, for the lies you told, but I will never forgive you if you lie to me again." Jake turned to face her fully. "Never again. I promise you that." "Good. Because we have work to do. The galaxy has seen what human tactics can accomplish. Earth will receive an invitation to join the Galactic Council as a full member, and you will serve as their first ambassador." "And us?" Jake asked quietly. Queen Lyrelai smiled, taking his hand in all four of hers. "We will rebuild the worlds that were damaged and create something better than what existed before, together, as partners who finally know the truth about each other." In the months that followed, Jake worked alongside his wife to restore the conquered worlds. They used both Zephyrian resources and human agricultural knowledge to bring life back to planets the Zerathi had stripped bare. The palace gardens became a symbol of renewal, where Earth vegetables grew beside alien flowers under the light of distant suns. The final scene found Jake teaching young Zephyrian children how to grow tomatoes while Queen Lyrelai watched from the palace windows. The children laughed as they learned about soil and seeds, while their parents worked to rebuild a civilization that had been saved by the most unlikely of heroes. The galaxy had learned an important lesson, that true strength sometimes comes from those who choose to appear ordinary until the moment when extraordinary courage is needed most. And in the crystal palace of Zephyros Prime, a human farmer's son and an alien queen ruled together, proving that love and trust could overcome even the greatest deceptions when they served a greater good.